Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about ebooks for kids.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, those interactive ones, like the ones with the sounds and animations. And we're going to try to answer that big question that a lot of parents have. Are these things actually helping kids learn? Or are they just, fancy distractions? And to help us unpack all of this, we've got a really fascinating article from Knowable magazine.
I'm excited to dive in.
Me too. It's funny because we often think about technology as this brand new thing that's, impacting kids.
Right.
But when you really think about it, even the earliest children's books kind of had an agenda.
That's true.
Like way back in the 1400s, kids were learning from these things called horn books, which were basically like wooden paddles.
Wooden paddles.
Yeah, like literally wooden paddles with the alphabet on them.
Wow.
And, they were designed to teach very specific things.
Yeah, so like what?
Like religious verses and stuff like that.
Interesting.
But then as time went on, children's books started to shift a little bit towards enjoyment and entertainment. In the 1700s, books started to include more playful stories and illustrations.
Yeah.
And now, with ebooks, it's like we're seeing this whole new evolution of how kids experience stories.
Definitely.
But it's definitely raising some, tough questions.
It is.
Yeah.
Especially because we're seeing this rise in ebook use, particularly among Black and lower income families.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings up the issue of the word gap, where children who aren't read to regularly might be exposed to far fewer words by the time they reach school age.
Oh, wow. That's a big concern, right? I mean, we all know how important those early years are for language development. So it makes you wonder if ebooks could actually help close that gap, or they might actually worsen it.
Yeah, and a lot of that debate centers around the interactivity of ebooks.
Yeah, all those bells and whistles. Are they actually helping kids, engage with the story, or are they just pulling their attention in a million different directions?
Yes.
I've seen it with my own kids sometimes, They get so caught up in the tapping and the swiping that they totally miss the actual story.
It's so true.
So what does the research say about this?
Well, there have been some interesting studies. For example, one study from Temple University found that kids actually had lower comprehension of a story when they read it on an ebook compared to a traditional book.
Really? Even though they might have spent more time with the ebook overall.
Right. It seems like all the interactive elements were actually distracting them from really absorbing the story.
So does that mean we should just ditch the ebooks altogether?
Not necessarily. Another study by Hasnur Das found that there wasn't actually difference in comprehension between ebooks and print books, as long as parents were engaging in something called dialogic reading.
Dialogic reading, what is that?
It's basically a style of reading where parents ask questions and relate the story to the child's own life and encourage them to think critically about what they're reading.
So it's not just about reading the words on the page, it's about having a conversation around the story.
Exactly, and that back and forth interaction seems to be key for comprehension, regardless of the format.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about kids who maybe don't have a parent or caregiver who can read with them regularly? Could ebooks potentially fill that gap?
That's a really interesting question. And the article highlights some fascinating examples where ebooks have been used to support literacy in underserved communities.
Oh, really? What? Tell me more.
Well, there's this amazing study done with children in Ethiopia who had no access to traditional schooling.
Wow.
And they were given tablets loaded with literacy apps. And essentially, they were able to teach themselves basic reading skills.
Wow, that's incredible. So even without direct adult interaction, these kids were able to learn from the ebooks?
Yes, and their reading levels were comparable to American kindergartners.
Wow.
It suggests that ebooks in certain contexts can have a really powerful impact on literacy development.
Okay, so we're seeing some potential benefits here, but I imagine there are also some downsides to consider.
Absolutely, and the article brings up some valid concerns voiced by experts in child development. One of the key issues is what's called the orienting reflex.
The orienting reflex, what is that?
It's basically a natural instinct in young children to pay attention to anything new and stimulating. So imagine all the flashing lights and sounds on an ebook.
Right.
It can really overstimulate their brains and make it hard for them to focus.
So it's like they're constantly being bombarded with distractions.
Exactly. And this is especially concerning because there are these crucial periods in brain development where children need focused attention to develop language and reading skills.
So even if they're spending time with ebooks, they might not be getting that kind of focused attention that they need to really learn and grow.
That's right. And there's some research to back this up. A pediatrician and researcher named John Hutton conducted a brain imaging study that showed that children who exceeded screen time recommendations actually had weaker neural connections in areas related to language and reading.
Oh, wow, that's pretty alarming. So it's not just about how much time they spend with ebooks, but it's also about the quality of that interaction.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of being really intentional about which ebooks we choose for our kids.
Okay, so what should parents be looking for then? Like, what are the signs of a good ebook versus a bad one?
Well, one of the key things to consider is the level of distraction. Are there tons of flashing lights and sounds that are going to pull the child's attention away from the story? Or are the interactive elements designed to enhance their understanding and engagement with the content?
Like the difference between a toy, that's just meant to entertain, versus a toy that actually teaches something.
Exactly. And another important factor is the quality of the story itself. Is it well written and engaging? Does it promote critical thinking and imagination?
Because at the end of the day, it's the story that really matters, right?
Absolutely. We don't want to get so caught up in the technology that we lose sight of the power of storytelling.
And I think that's where a lot of parents get concerned. They worry that ebooks might be replaced. You know those cozy bedtime rituals of reading a physical book together?
I understand that concern. And the article highlights that many parents feel hesitant about ebook use, particularly for younger children.
So it's not just experts raising these concerns. Parents are noticing it too.
Right. And it's important to acknowledge those concerns and to be thoughtful about how we integrate ebooks into our children's lives.
It's not about saying like ebooks are bad or ebooks are good. It's about finding that balance and choosing wisely.
Exactly. And a helpful framework for thinking about this is what are often called the 4 pillars of learning, which are often used to evaluate children's media.
Okay, what are those 4 pillars?
They're active involvement, engagement, meaningfulness, and social interaction.
So it's not just about passive consumption. It's about whether the child is actively engaged. The material, whether it's meaningful to them, and whether it encourages social interaction.
Precisely. And as Jennifer Zosh, who is a researcher who studies children and digital media, points out, engagement is a tricky one. Too much of it can actually be detrimental.
So it's not just about keeping them entertained. It's about making sure that that engagement is actually supporting their learning and development.
Right. And this is where we need to be wary of what are sometimes called shoddy ebooks that are designed more for profit than for actual education.
They might have all the bells and whistles, but they might not be promoting meaningful learning.
Exactly.
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in like the flashy features, but we need to remember, we're talking about young minds here, and we want to make sure we're giving the best possible foundation for learning and growth.
Exactly. And I think that's a great place to pause for now.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into ebooks for kids. We've seen that there are both potential benefits and risks to consider.
But we've also learned some really valuable tips for choosing wisely and making sure that ebooks are supporting our children's development rather than hindering it.
Exactly. And in the next part, we'll delve even deeper into some of the strategies that parents and caregivers can use to make the most of ebooks and ensure that they're part of a balanced and enriching learning experience. So stay tuned. Okay, so you mentioned these 4 pillars of learning: active involvement, engagement, meaningfulness, and social interaction, and how those are really crucial for evaluating children's media. So how can parents actually apply these pillars when they're choosing ebooks for their kids?
Well, I think it starts with being really observant and
Yeah.
asking yourself some key questions. For example, does the ebook encourage your child to participate in the story somehow? Maybe by making choices or solving puzzles, or even just tapping on objects to learn more about them. That's the active involvement pillar in action.
So it's not just about like passively watching or listening, it's actually doing something within the ebook itself.
Exactly. And then there's engagement. We talked about how too much engagement can actually be a bad thing. So look for ebooks where the interactive elements feel purposeful and it enhance the story rather than just being there for the sake of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I think about some of the ebooks that my kids have enjoyed, the ones that really stand out are the
Yeah.
ones that have like a simple, engaging story at their core, and then the interactive elements are almost like a bonus, not the main attraction.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to the importance of the meaningfulness pillar. Does the story resonate with your child? Does it connect to their interests? Their experiences are the things they're learning about in the world around them. Those are the kinds of ebooks that will stick with them.
And what about the social interaction piece? I know some people worry that ebooks are isolating. You know that kids are just staring at screens by themselves.
It's a valid concern. But I think there are ways to make ebooks a more social experience. For instance, you can read the ebook together as a family and talk about the story afterward. Or you can even encourage your child to act out scenes from the ebook with their friends.
So it's not just about the technology itself. It's about how we use it to create those opportunities for connection and conversation.
Exactly. And remember, technology is always evolving. There are some really innovative ebooks out there that actually incorporate social interaction directly into the experience.
Well, really? Like what?
Well, there are ebooks that allow kids to record their own voices reading the story or create their own illustrations, and then they can share those creations with friends and family members. It's a way to make the ebook experience more personal and interactive.
That's really cool. It's like taking those traditional activities of like reading aloud or drawing pictures and bringing them into the digital world.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that ebooks don't have to be a replacement for those traditional activities. They can actually complement them and create new possibilities.
Okay, so we've talked about like what to look for in a good ebook, but I think it's also important to address the concerns that some parents have about screen time in general. So how do we find that balance between embracing the potential of ebooks and making sure our kids aren't spending too much time glued to screens?
That's such a crucial question. And there's no one-size-fits-all answer. Every family has to find what works for them. But there are some general guidelines that can be helpful.
Like what?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that ebooks are just one form of screen time. So you need to look at your child's overall screen time and make sure it's balanced with other activities, like playing outdoors, socializing with friends, engaging in creative play.
Right, it's easy to get like hyper-focused on one specific type of screen time, but we need to keep the bigger picture in mind.
Absolutely. And when it comes to ebooks specifically, you can set limits on how much time your child spends reading them each day. Or you can create designated times for ebook reading, like before bed or during quiet time.
And I imagine it's also important to be mindful of the content itself. Just like we wouldn't let our kids watch any TV show, we shouldn't let them read just any ebook.
You're absolutely right. It's essential to preview ebooks before you let your child read them and make sure they're age appropriate and align with your family's values.
And it's not just about avoiding inappropriate content. It's also about choosing ebooks that are stimulating and enriching rather than just mindless entertainment.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to be selective. There are so many ebooks out there, and it's okay to be picky and choose the ones that you think will truly benefit your child.
It's like curating their digital library, just like we would curate their physical bookshelf.
I love that analogy. It's about being thoughtful and intentional about the digital world we're creating for our children.
And it's about being present and engaged with them, regardless of the format.
Absolutely. Reading together, talking about the story, making connections to real life. Those are the things that will make the experience truly meaningful for your child.
You know, it strikes me that this conversation about ebooks is actually part of a much larger conversation about technology and childhood. It's like we're constantly trying to figure out how to navigate this new landscape and make sure our kids are thriving in it.
It is a big conversation, and it's one that we're all figuring out together. But I think the key is to approach it with curiosity, open-mindedness, and a willingness to adapt.
I agree. And to remember that technology is a tool. It can be used for good or for ill. And it's up to us to guide our children in using it wisely.
Well said. And I think that leads us to a really important question. How do we ensure that technology enhances rather than diminishes the essential human connection at the heart of learning?
That's a powerful question, and one that we'll explore in more depth in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be back after a quick break.
Okay, so we're back. And I think it's time to really dig into that question that you posed at the end of the last part about how to make sure that you know technology enhances rather than diminishes the human connection at the heart of learning.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And I think it's something that a lot of parents are grappling with these days.
For sure.
You know, we've seen how ebooks can be a valuable tool for learning.
Yeah.
But we also know that nothing can replace those real-life interactions.
And connections.
Right, like how do we find that balance? How do we make sure technology is supporting those human connections?
Yeah.
rather than getting in the way.
Well, I think it starts with being mindful of how we're using technology in our own lives. Are we constantly glued to our phones, even when we're with our kids? Are we modeling healthy tech habits for them?
Oh, that's so true. I mean, kids are like little sponges, right? They absorb everything they see us doing.
Exactly. So if we want them to have a healthy relationship with technology, we need to have one ourselves.
Makes sense.
That means setting boundaries, being present in the moment, and making sure technology isn't taking over our lives.
So it's not just about the rules and limits we set for our kids. It's about the example we're setting. Absolutely. And when it comes to ebooks specifically, I think it's important to remember that they can actually be a springboard for those human connections.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, imagine you're reading an ebook with your child about animals. Afterward, you could go to the zoo together or visit a local farm. Or maybe the ebook sparks a conversation about a topic they're interested in, and you can do some research together online or at the library.
So instead of viewing ebooks as like a replacement for those real-world experiences, we can actually use them as a way to inspire further exploration and connection.
Exactly.
I like
But
that.
I think it's also important to create what I call tech-free zones in our homes and in our lives.
Oh, like a digital detox kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's meal times, family game night, or even just an hour before bedtime. You know, those tech-free zones give everyone a chance to connect, relax, and be fully present with each other.
I love that. It's like hitting the reset button on our brains.
And it is.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to foster those human connections outside of the family as well.
Yeah.
Encourage your kids to spend time with friends, participate in extracurricular activities, engage with their community.
It's all about building those social skills and those real-world relationships that are so essential for their development.
Exactly. Technology can be a great tool for connecting with people, but it shouldn't be the only way our kids are connecting.
This has been such a great conversation. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on this.
Me too.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's like the biggest takeaway you want our listeners to leave with?
I think the most important thing is to remember that technology is constantly changing, but the fundamentals of child development remain the same. Kids need love, connection, and opportunities to explore and learn in the real world. Technology can play a role in all of that, but it should never be a substitute for those essential human experiences.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Huge thank you to you for joining us today and for sharing all of your insights.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of ebooks for kids. We hope you found it informative. And we'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to connect with us on social media or leave us a comment on our website. Be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive so you don't miss out on future episodes, where we'll continue to explore these fascinating topics. Until next time, keep those conversations going and keep learning.